Alrighty. Sorry about the delay. I had work stuff I had to get done. And also I apologize that there's no real intro in the in the stream description. You'll just have to grin and bear it. Because I didn't have time. I was rushing. I was rushing. Well, so be it. So yeah, welcome back to Wordy Wednesdays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fragath, and today we're going to be reading more of Permutation City by one Gregg Egan, an author I definitely don't fanboy over at all, ever. No, sir. Um, I fanboy over them constantly. That's what I do. So, where are we? Thus, we've got this guy. His name's Paul Durham, and he is researching how copies work. Copies are basically brain scans of a person and are a running simulation of a human being mind. Um, this is something that the wealthy frequently choose to do. Occasionally, somebody will get into a terrible accident and have a copy made. Um, Usually it's the remit of the wealthy and eccentric. The overwhelming majority of copies decide, nope, I can't do this. Um, I cannot live like this. This is not going to work, and they bail out, as they say, um, and terminate, self-terminate, because being trapped in a an obviously virtual reality is just they can't handle it. They're like, no, no, sorry, I don't like what I've become. The philosophical ramifications are too dire, the metaphysical ramifications are too strange, what have you, whatever reasons they may have. But there is a percentage of them that do not kill themselves or go crazy. Um, and Paul Durham just kind of wants to know more about this process and wants to do some research on it. Now you'd think it's super well documented, but it's more like the nitty gritties of how exactly they work. Everybody knows they work, um, but he's trying to. So one of the tests he's doing is he's got his copy, who's not pleased about this. You'd you'd think he'd agree, and he did. He did agree to it, but when you're the copy and not the guy outside in meat space, things your perspective is rather different. Um, and he's had the option to bail out removed from him, which is pretty messed up in its way. Um, at any rate, one of the tests he has his copy do is basically count from 1 to 10, and he's basically slowing the clock speed, if I recall correctly. Did he not? Did he? Is that what he did? Time resolution. Yeah, basically the clock speed to see what's happening, and it's gonna have stuff to do with determinism, how they're determining their actions, that sort of thing. Um, we're still learning about that. Now we've got another character, Maria De Luca, who um, is an autoverse addict, for lack of a better term. There is a virtual reality called the Autoverse. It has its own chemistry and physics that are based on our own, and she is trying to get the digital equivalent of E. coli to mutate um, on its own, which it does not want to do for whatever reason. Nobody's quite sure, but she is doing that. It is a digital molecule, a virtual autobacterium called Autobacterium lamberti, and she's performing a test which costs her money, by the way, to use the Autoverse. It's like $50 an hour or something. Um, and she gets booted off because a consortium is using all the available uh, spare cloud capacity to run a simulation on I think it's a Typhoon, if memory serves. Sure, call it a Typhoon. basically to see if they can find a way to find how they start and how to mitigate them virtually. And then if they can mitigate them virtually, they should be able to do it in reality. Anyway, she's got a meeting, and that's where we will pick up. The way she makes her money is by making security code, uh, which is a hard Scrabble life, as it were. Alrighty. Yeah, we'll tentatively do it there. Don't lose your bookmark, my friend. Hello, Liz Angel. Thanks for tuning in. Alrighty, give me one sec to get a little more water in me, and we will get crack-a-lackin'. Chapter 4. Remit Not Paucity. November 2050. Maria had arranged to meet Aidan at the Nadir, an Oxford Street nightclub where he sometimes played, and often went to write. He could usually get them both in for free, and the door, an intimidating, airlock-like contraption of ribbed black and anodized steel, let her pass unchallenged after a brief security scan. Maria had once had a nightmare in which she'd been trapped in that chamber, a knife inexplicably strapped to her right boot, and, worse, her credit rating cancelled. The thing had digested her like an insect in a Venus flytrap, while Aidan stood on stage, singing one of his cut-up love songs. Inside, the place was crowded for a Thursday night, and poorly lit as always. She finally spotted Aidan sitting at a table near a side wall, listening to one of the bands and jotting down music, his face catching the glow of his notepad. So far as Maria could tell, he never seemed to be unduly influenced by anything he listened to while composing, but he claimed to be unable to work in silence, and preferred live performances for inspiration, or catalysis, or whatever it was. She touched him on the shoulder. He looked up, took off his headset, and stood to kiss her. He tasted of orange juice. He gestured with the headset. "You should listen. Crooked Buddhist lawyers on crack. They're quite good." Maria glanced at the stage, although there was no way of telling who he meant. A dozen performers, 4 bands in all, stood enclosed in individual soundproof plastic cylinders. Most of the patrons were tuned in, wearing headsets to pick up one band's sound, and liquid crystal shades flickering in sync with one group of cylinders to render the other bands invisible. A few people were chatting quietly, and of the room's 5 possible soundtracks, Maria decided that this tranquil near silence best suited her mood. Besides, she never much liked using nerve current inducers. Although physically unable to damage the eardrums, sparing the management any risk of litigation, they always seemed to leave her ears, or her auditory pathways, ringing, regardless of the volume setting she chose. "Maybe later." She sat beside Aidan, and felt him tense slightly when their shoulders brushed, then forced himself to relax. Or maybe not. Often, when she thought she was reading his body language, she was making signals out of noise. She said, "I got some junk mail today that looked just like you." "How flattering, I think. What was it selling?" "The Church of the God Who Makes No Difference." He laughed. "Every time I hear that, I think they've got to change the name. A God who makes no difference doesn't rate the definite article of the pronoun who." "I'll rerun the program, and the two of you can fight it out." "No, thanks." He took a sip of his drink. "Any non-junk mail? Any contracts?" "No." "So, another day of terminal boredom?" "Mostly." Maria hesitated. Aidan usually only pressed her for news when he had something to announce himself, and she was curious to find out what it was. But he volunteered nothing, so she went on to describe her encounter with Operation Butterfly. Aidan said, "I remember hearing something about that, but I thought it was decades away." "The real thing probably is, but the simulations have definitely started, in a big way." He looked pained. "Weather control? Who do they think they're kidding?" Maria suppressed her irritation. The theory must look promising, or they wouldn't have taken it this far. Nobody spends a few $1 million an hour on supercomputer time without a good chance of a payoff. Egan snickered. Oh, yes, they do. And it's usually called Operation Something or Other. Remember Operation Radiant Way? Yes, I remember. They were going to seed the upper atmosphere with nanomachines which could monitor the temperature and supposedly do something about it. Manufacture particles which reflected certain wavelengths of solar radiation, and then disassemble them as required. In other words, cover the planet with a giant thermostatic blanket. What's so terrible about that? You mean apart from the sheer technocratic hubris, and apart from the fact that releasing any kind of replicator into the environment is still, thankfully, illegal? It wouldn't have worked. There were complications nobody had predicted. Unstable mixing of air layers, wasn't it? Which would have counteracted most of the effect. Maria said, Exactly. But how would anyone have known that if they hadn't run a proper simulation? Common sense? This whole idea of throwing technology at problems created by technology. Maria felt her patience desert her. What would you rather do? Be humble in the presence of nature and hope you'll be rewarded for it? You think Mother Gaia is going to forgive us and put everything right just as soon as we throw away our wicked computers and promise to stop trying to fix things ourselves? Should have made that nanny Gaia. Aidan scowled. No, but the only way to fix things is to have less impact on the planet, not more. Instead of thinking up these grandiose schemes to bludgeon everything into shape, we have to back off, leave it alone, give it a chance to heal. Maria was bemused. It's too late for that. If that had started 100 years ago, fine. Everything might have turned out differently. But it's not enough anymore. Too much damage has already been done. Tiptoeing through the debris, hoping all the systems we've fucked up will magically restore themselves, and tiptoeing twice as carefully every time the population doubles, just won't work. The whole planetary ecosystem is as much of an artifact now as a city's microclimate. Believe me, I wish that wasn't the case, but it is. And now that we've created an artificial world, intentionally or not, we'd better learn to control it. Because if we stand back and leave it all to chance, it's just going to collapse around us in some random fashion that isn't likely to be any better than our worst well-intentioned mistakes. Aidan was horrified. An artificial world? You honestly believe that? Yes. Only because you spend so much time in virtual reality you don't know the difference anymore. Maria was indignant. I hardly ever. Then she stopped herself, realizing that he meant the autoverse. She'd long ago given up trying to drum the distinction into his head. Aidan said, I'm sorry, that was a cheap shot. He made a gesture of retraction, a wave of the hand more impatient than apologetic. Look, forget all this depressing eco shit. I've got some good news for a change. We're going to Seoul. Maria laughed. Are we? Why? I've been offered a job. University music department. She looked at him sharply. Thanks for telling me you'd applied. He shrugged it off lightly. I didn't want to get your hopes up. Or mine. I only heard it this afternoon. I can still hardly believe it. Composer in residence for a year. A couple of hours a week teaching. The rest of the time I can do what I like. Writing, performing, producing, whatever. And they throw in free accommodation. For two. Just hold it. A few hours teaching? Then why do you have to go there in person? They want me, physically. It's a prestige thing. Every Mickey Mouse university can plug into the networks and bring in a dozen lecturers from around the world. That's not Mickey Mouse, it's efficient. Cheap and efficient. This place doesn't want to be cheap. They want a piece of exotic cultural decoration. Stop laughing. Australia is flavor of the month in Seoul, and it only happens once every 20 years, so we better take advantage of it. So they're in Australia. For some reason, I didn't know that, so now he's Australian. Sorry, we're going to shift gears abruptly. I knew I was going to have to do an Australian voice at some point. Uh, and they want a composer in residence. In residence. Maria sat back and digested it. Eden said, I don't know about you, but I have a lot of trouble imagining us ever being able to spend a year in Korea any other way. And you've said yes? I said maybe. I said probably. Accommodation for two? What am I supposed to do while you're being exotic and decorative? Whatever you like. Anything you do here, you could do just as easily there. You're the one who keeps telling me how you're plugged into the world. You're a node in a logical data space. Your physical location is entirely irrelevant. Yes, and the whole point of that is not having to move. I like it where I am. That shoebox. A campus apartment in Seoul won't be much bigger. Well, go out. It's an exciting city. There's a whole cultural renaissance going on there. It's not just the music scene. And who knows? You might find some exciting project to work on. Not everything gets broadcast over the nets. That was true enough. Korea had full membership of ASEAN, as opposed to Australia's probationary status. If she'd been living in Seoul at the right time, if she'd had the right contacts, she might have ended up a part of Operation Butterfly. And even if that was wishful thinking, the right contacts probably took a decade to make, she could hardly do worse than she'd been doing in Sydney. Maria fell silent. It was good news, a rare opportunity for both of them, but she still couldn't understand why he was unloading it on her out of the blue. He should have told her everything when he'd applied, however poorly he'd rated his chances. She glanced at the stage, at the 12 sweating musicians playing their hearts out, then looked away. There was something disconcertingly voyeuristic about watching them without tuning in. Not just the sight of them emoting in silence, but also the realization that none of the bands could see each other, despite the fact that she could see them all. Aidan said, "There's no rush to make up your mind. The academic year starts on January 9th, 2 months away. Won't they need to know long before then?" "They'll need to know by Monday if I've accepted the job, but I don't think the accommodations will be a big deal. I mean, if I end up alone in an apartment for two, it'll hardly be the end of the world." He looked at her innocently, as if daring her to give the time and place he'd ever promised to turn down a chance like this, just because she didn't want to come along for the ride. Maria said, "No, of course not. How stupid of me." Home, Maria couldn't resist logging on to the Quips exchange, just to find out what was going on. Operation Butterfly had vanished from the market. Omnia Veritas, her knowledge miner, had picked up no news reports of a typhoon in the region. Perhaps the predicted one had failed to eventuate. Or perhaps it was yet to appear, but the simulations had already given their verdict. It was strange to think that it could all be over before the storm was a reality. But then, by the time anything newsworthy happened, the actual meteorological data would, hopefully, bear no relationship at all to what would have happened if the weather control rigs had been in use. The only real-world data needed for the simulations was the common starting point, a snapshot of the planet's weather the moment before intervention would have begun. The Quips rate was still about 50% higher than normal as ordinary users joined to get their delayed work done. Maria hesitated. She felt like she needed cheering up, but running the Autoverse now would be stupid. It would make far more sense to wait till morning. She logged on to the JSN, slipped on her gloves, activated the workspace. An icon of a man tripping on a banana skin, frozen in mid-fall, represented the snapshot of her interrupted task. She prodded it, and the petri dishes reappeared in front of her instantly, the A. Lamberti feeding, dividing, and dying, as if the past 15 hours had never happened. She could have asked Aidan to his face, "Do you want to go to Seoul alone? Do you want a year away from me? If that's it, why don't you just say so?" But he would have denied it, whether or not it was the truth. And she wouldn't have believed him, whether or not he was lying. Why ask the question if the answer told you nothing? And it hardly seemed to matter now. Seoul or Sydney, welcome or not. She could reach this place from anywhere, geographically or emotionally. She stared into the workspace, ran a gloved finger around the rim of one of her petri dishes, and declaimed mockingly, "My name is Maria, and I am an Autoverse addict." As she watched, the culture in the dish she'd touched faded from muddy blue to pure brown, and then began to turn transparent, as the viewing software ceased classifying dead A. Lamberti as anything more than chance arrangements of organic molecules. As the brown mass dissolved, though, Maria noticed something she'd missed. A tiny speck of electric blue. She zoomed in on it, refusing to leap to conclusions. The speck was a small cluster of surviving bacteria, growing slowly, but that didn't prove anything. Some strains always lasted longer than others. In the most pedantic sense, there was always a degree of natural selection taking place. But the honor of being the last of the dinosaurs wasn't the kind of evolutionary triumph she was looking for. She summoned up a histogram showing the prevalence of different forms of epimerase enzymes, the tools she'd been pinning her hopes on to turn mutos back into neutros. But there was nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual scatter of short-lived, unsuccessful mutations. No hint of how this strain was different from all of its extinct cousins. So why was he doing so well? Maria tagged a portion of the mutose molecules in the culture medium, assigning multiple clones of Maxwell's demon to track their movements and render them visible. The autoverse equivalent of the real-world biochemist's technique of radioactive labeling, along with something like nuclear magnetic resonance, since the demons would signal any chemical changes as well as indicating position. She zoomed in on one surviving A. Lamberti, rendered neutral gray now, and watched a swarm of phosphorescent green pinpricks pass through the cell wall and jostle around the protoplasm in the sway of Brownian motion. One by one, a fraction of the tags changed from green to red, marking passage through the first stage of the metabolic pathway, the attachment of an energy-rich cluster of atoms, more or less the autoverse equivalent of a phosphate group. But there was nothing new in that. For the first three stages of the process, the enzymes which worked with neutros would squander energy on the imposter as if it were the real thing. Strictly speaking, these red specks weren't mutos anymore, but Maria had instructed the demons to turn an unmistakable violet. Not only... Whoops. I think I skipped a line somewhere. Strictly speaking, these red specks weren't mutos anymore, but Maria had instructed the demons to turn an unmistakable violet. Violet, not only in the presence of neutros itself, but also if the molecules under scrutiny were rehabilitated at a later stage, salvaged in mid-digestion. With the epimerase enzymes unchanged, she doubted that this was happening, but the bacteria were thriving, somehow. The red-tagged molecules wandered the cell at random, part digested, mixed with raw indiscriminately. Neat process diagrams of metabolism, the real-world Embden-Meyerhof pathway or the autoverse's Lambert pathway, always gave the impression of some orderly molecular conveyor belt, but the truth was, life in either system was powered by nothing at the deepest level but a sequence of chance collisions. A few red tags turned orange. Stage 2, an enzyme tightening the molecule's hexagonal ring into a pentagon, transforming the spare vertex into a protruding cluster, more exposed and reactive than before. Still nothing new. And still no hint of violet. Nothing further seemed to happen for so long that Maria glanced at her watch and said, "Globe," to see if some major population center had just come online for the day. But the authentic Earth-from-space view showed dawn well into the Pacific. California would have been busy since before she'd arrived home. A few orange tags turned yellow. Stage 3 of the Lambert pathway, like Stage 1, consisted of bonding an energy-rich group of atoms to the sugar. With neutros, there was a payoff for this, eventually, with twice as many of the molecules which supplied the energy ending up recharged as had been drained. Stage 4, though, the cleaving of the ring into two smaller fragments, was the point where mutos gummed up the works irretrievably. Except that one yellow speck had just split into two before her eyes, and both new tags were colored violet. Maria, startled, lost track of the evidence. Then she caught sight of the same thing happening again, and then a third time. It took her a minute to think it through and understand what this meant. The bacterium wasn't reversing the change she'd made to the sugar, converting mutos back into neutros, or doing the same to some part-digested metabolite. Instead, it must have modified the enzyme which broke the ring, coming up with a version which worked directly on the metabolite of mutos. Maria, Maria froze the action, zoomed in, and watched a molecular scale replay. The enzyme in question was constructed of thousands of atoms. It was impossible to spot the difference at a glance. But there was no doubt about what it was doing. The two-atom blue-red spike she'd repositioned on the sugar was never shifted back into its proper place. Instead, the enzyme now accommodated the altered geometry perfectly. She summoned up old and new versions of the enzyme, highlighted the regions where the tertiary structure was different, and probed them with her fingertips, confirming, palpably, that the cavity in the giant molecule where the reaction took place had changed shape. And once the ring was cleaved, the fragments were the same, whether the original sugar had been neutros or mutos. The rest of the Lambert pathway went on as if nothing had changed. Maria was elated and a little dazed. People had been trying to achieve a spontaneous adaptation like this for 16 years. She didn't even know why she'd finally succeeded. For 5 years she'd been tinkering with the bacterium's error correction mechanisms, trying to force A. lamberti to mutate, not more rapidly, but more randomly. Every time she'd ended up with a strain which, like Lambert's original, like those of other workers, suffered the same handful of predictable, useless mutations again and again, almost as if something deep in the clockwork of the autoverse itself ruled out the exuberant diversity which came so effortlessly to real-world biology. Calvin and others had suggested that, because autoverse physics omitted the deep indeterminacy of real-world quantum mechanics, because it lacked this vital inflow of true unpredictability, the same richness of phenomena could never be expected at any level. But that had always been absurd, and now she'd proved it was absurd. For a moment she thought of phoning Aidan or Francesca, but Aidan wouldn't understand enough to do more than nod politely, and her mother didn't deserve to be woken at this hour. She got up and paced the tiny bedroom for a while, too excited to remain still. She'd upload a letter to Autoverse Review, total subscription 73. With the genome of the strain she'd started out with with the genome of the strain she'd started out with appended as a footnote, so everyone else could try the experiment. She sat down and began composing the letter, popping up a word processor in the foreground of the workspace, and then decided that was premature. There was still a lot more to be done to form the basis of even a brief report. She cloned a small colony of the mutos-eating strain and watched it grow steadily in a culture of pure mutos. No surprise, but it was still worth doing. Then she did the same with pure neutros, and the colony, of course, died out at once. The original ring-cleaving enzyme had been lost. The original roles of neutros and mutos as food and poison had been swapped. Maria pondered this. A. Lamberti had adapted, but not in the way she'd expected. Why hadn't it found a means of consuming both sugars, instead of exchanging one kind of exclusive reliance for another? It would have been a far better strategy. It was what a real-world bacterium would have done. She brooded over the question for a while, then started laughing. 16 years people had been hunting for a single convincing example of natural selection in the autoverse, and here she was worrying that it wasn't the best of all possible adaptations. Evolution was a random walk across a minefield, not a preordained trajectory, onward and upward toward perfection. A. Lamberti had stumbled on a successful way to turn poison into food. It was tough luck if the corollary was vice versa. Maria ran a dozen more experiments. She lost all track of time. When dawn came, the software brightened the images in front of her, keeping the daylight from washing them out. It was only when her concentration faltered and she looked around the room that she realized how late it was. She started again on the letter. After 3 drafts of the first paragraph, all eliciting the same response from Camel's Eye, "You'll hate this when you reread it later. Trust me." She finally admitted to herself that she was wasted. She shut down everything and crawled into bed. She lay there a while in a stupor, burying her face in the pillow, waiting for the ghost images of petri dishes and enzymes to fade. 5 years ago she could have worked all night and suffered nothing worse than a fit of yawning in the middle of the afternoon. Now she felt like she'd been hit by a train, and she knew she'd be a wreck for days. 31 is old, old, old. Her head throbbed. Her whole body ached. She didn't care. All the time and money she'd squandered on the Autoverse was worth it now. Every moment she'd spent there had been vindicated. Yeah? She rolled onto her back and opened her eyes. What exactly had changed? It was still nothing but a self-indulgent hobby, an elaborate computer game. She'd be famous with 72 other anal-retentive Autoverse freaks. How many bills would that pay? How many typhoons would it neutralize? She wrapped her head in the pillow, feeling crippled, stupid, hopeless, and defiantly happy, until her limbs went numb, her mouth went dry, and the room seemed to rock her to sleep. To sleep. There we go. Chapter 5. Remit Not Paucity. November 2050. Pier anchored the soles of both feet and the palm of one hand firmly against the glass, and rested for a while. He tipped his head back to take in, one more time, the silver wall of the skyscraper stretching to infinity above him. Cotton-wool clouds drifted by, higher than any part of the building, even though the building went on forever. He freed his right foot, re-anchored it higher up the wall, then turned and looked down at the neat grid of the city below, surrounded by suburbs as orderly as plowed fields. The foreshortened countryside beyond formed a green-brown rim to the hemispherical bowl of the earth. A blue-hazed horizon bisected the view precisely. The features of the landscape, like the clouds, were infinitely large and infinitely distant. A finite city, however grand, would have shrunk to invisibility, like the base of the skyscraper. The distance was more than a trick of perspective, though. Pier knew that he could keep on approaching the ground for as long as he liked, without ever reaching it. Hours, days, centuries. He couldn't remember beginning the descent, although he understood clearly cloud knowledge, cloud memories, the sense in which there was a beginning and the sense in which there was none. His memories of the skyscraper, like his view of it, seemed to converge toward a vanishing point. Looking back from the present moment, all he could recall was the act of descending, punctuated by rest. And although his mind had wandered, he'd never lost consciousness. His past seemed to stretch back seamlessly forever. Yet he could hold it all in his finite gaze, thanks to some law of mental perspective, some calculus of memory limiting the sum of ever-diminishing contributions to his state of mind from ever more distant moments in the past. He couldn't join them to the present, but they existed nonetheless, a backdrop informing everything else. He knew exactly who he'd been, and what he'd done, in that time before the time he now inhabited. Pier had been exhausted when he'd stopped, but after a minute's rest he felt, literally, as energetic and enthusiastic as ever. Back in cloud time, preparing himself, he'd edited out any need or desire for food, drink, sleep, sex, companionship, or even a change of scenery, and he'd pre-programmed his exo-self, the sophisticated but non-conscious supervisory software which could reach into the model of his brain and body and fine-tune any part of it as required, to ensure that these conditions remained true. He resumed the descent gladly, a happy Sisyphus. Making his way down the smooth mirrored face of the skyscraper was, still, the purest joy he could imagine, the warmth of the sun reflecting back on him, the sharp, cool gusts of wind, the faint creak of steel and concrete. Adrenaline and tranquility, the cycle of exertion and perfect recovery, perpetual motion, touching infinity. The building, the earth, the sky, and his body vanished. Stripped down to vision and hearing, Pier found himself observing his bunker, a cluster of display screens floating in a black void. Kate was on one screen, two-dimensional, black and white, nothing but her lips moving. She said, "You set your threshold pretty damn high. You'd be hearing about this a decade later if I hadn't called you in." Pier grunted, disconcerted for a moment by the lack of tactile feedback from the conventional organs of speech, and glanced, by way of eye movement intention, at the screen beside her, a graph of the recent history of bunker time versus real time. Observing the bunker, being in it would have been an overstatement, was the most computing efficient state a copy could adopt, short of losing consciousness. Pier's body was no longer being simulated at all. The essential parts of his model of a brain had been mapped onto an abstract neural network, a collection of idealized digital gates with no pretensions to physiological verisimilitude. He didn't enter this state very often, but bunker time was still a useful standard as a basis for comparisons. At best, on the rare occasions when demand slackened and he shared a processor cluster with only 2 or 3 other users, his bunker time slowdown factor dropped to about 30. At worst, up until a few minutes ago, the worst had been happening. A section of the graph was perfectly flat. For more than 10 hours of real time, he hadn't been computed at all. Kate said, "Operation Butterfly, weather control simulations. The fuckers bought up everything." She sounded shaken and angry. Pier said calmly, "No great loss. Solipsistination means making your own world on your own terms, whatever the risks. Real time doesn't matter. Let them give us one computation per year. What would it change? Nothing." He glanced at another display and realized that he'd only been in the skyscraper model for 7 subjective minutes. The false memories had meshed perfectly. He would never have believed it. He would never have believed it had been so short a time. Pre-computing the memories had taken time, of course, but far less than it would have taken to accumulate the same effect by conventional experience. Kate said, "You're wrong. You don't—" "Let them run one moment of model time for one copy on every processor cluster the day it's commissioned, and then dedicate it entirely to other users. Each copy would thread its way from machine to machine with a slowdown of a few billion, and it wouldn't matter. The manufacturers could run all of us for free, turn it into a kind of ritual, a blessing of the hardware by the spirits of the dead. Then we could abolish all the trust funds and stop worrying about money altogether. The cheaper we are, the less vulnerable we are." "That's only half the truth. The more we're marginalized, the more we're at risk." Pier tried to sigh. The sound that emerged was plausible enough, but the lack of sensation was annoying. "Is there any reason to stay in emergency mode? Is there some snap decision I'm going to have to make? Are there missiles heading for—" He checked a display. "Dallas?" Dallas? The US dollar must have fallen sharply against the yen. Kate said nothing, so Pier glanced at icons for a body and a room and willed them to be active. His disembodied consciousness and the floating screens of the bunker fleshed out into a young man, barefoot in blue jeans and a t-shirt, sitting in a windowless control room, with what might have been the operations center for a medium-sized office building. The body's physiological state continued directly from its last moments on the wall of the skyscraper, and it felt good, loose-limbed, invigorated. Peer recorded a snapshot so he could get the feeling back again at will. He looked at Kate imploringly. She relented and joined him, vanishing from the screen and appearing on a chair beside him. One sec, I just have to double check to see if Peer is that wealthy guy that Durham was talking to. No, that was Thomas Riemann. Never mind. Ryman. So Peer is someone else. She said, I am Solipsist Nation. What happens outside doesn't matter to me, but we still need certain guarantees, certain minimum standards. Peer laughed. So what are you going to do? Become a lobbyist now? Spend all your time petitioning Brussels and Geneva? Human rights are for people who want to play at being human. I know who I am. I am not human. He plunged his fist into his chest, effortlessly penetrating shirt, skin, and ribs, and tore his heart out. He felt the parting of the flesh, and the aftermath. But although aspects of the pain were realistic, pre-programmed barriers kept it isolated within his brain, a perception without any emotional or even metabolic consequences. And his heart kept beating in his hand as if nothing had happened. The blood passed straight between the ragged ends of each broken artery, ignoring the intervening distance. Intervening distance is in quotes. I'm going to try and emphasize the quotes without saying quote unquote. Kate said, Blink and 10 hours are gone. That's no disaster. But where is it heading? State of emergency decrees, nationalizing all the computing power in Tokyo for weather control? Tokyo? Some models show greenhouse typhoons reaching the Japanese islands in the next 30 years. Fuck Tokyo. We're in Dallas. Not anymore. She pointed to the status display, exchange rate fluctuations, and the hunt for the cheapest quips, QIPS, which is quantum something something system. It's the processing. Where are you? Let me find what that stood for. What does it stand for? Blue red, blah 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 blah. Camel's eye, boo boo boo. Sorry, I can't remember. It's the processing power exchange, basically. Copies, cat scan, copy. Ah, here we go. Oh, here we go. It is the Quips exchange. It is Quips stands for quadrillions of instructions per second. Sorry. You could have just tuned in to the last stream and found that out, but you have to remember it through weeks, so I will try and find those. Not anymore. She pointed to the status display. Exchange rate fluctuations and the hunt for the cheapest quips had flung them back across the Pacific. Not that it matters. There are plans for the Gulf of Mexico, too. Peer put his heart on the floor and shrugged, then groped around in his chest cavity in search of other organs. He finally settled on a handful of lung. Torn free, the pink tissue continued to expand and contract in... I can't turn the page. Torn free, the pink tissue continued to expand and contract in time with his breathing. Functionally, it was still inside his rib cage. Start looking for security, and you end up controlled by the demands of the old world. Are you Solipsist Nation or not? Kate eyed his bloodless wound and said quietly, Solipsist Nation doesn't mean dying of stupidity. You take your body apart and you think it proves you're invulnerable? You plant a few forced perspective memories and you think you've already lived forever? I don't want some cheap illusion of immortality. I want the real thing. Peer frowned and started paying attention to her latest choice of body. It was still recognizably Kate, albeit the most severe variation on the theme he'd seen. Short-haired, sharp-boned, with piercing gray eyes, leaner than ever, plainly dressed in loose-fitting white. She looked ascetic, functional, determined. She said, mock casually, as if changing the subject, "Interesting news. There's a man, a visitor, approaching the richest copies, selling prime real estate for second versions at a ludicrous rate." "How much?" €2 million. "What, per month?" "No, forever." Pierce snorted. "It's a con." And outside, he's been contracting programmers, designers, architects, commissioning and paying for work that will need at least a few dozen processor clusters to run on. Good move. That might actually persuade a few of the doddering old farts that he can deliver what he's promising. Not many, though. Who's going to pay without getting the hardware online and running performance tests? How's he going to fake that? He can show them simulations of glossy machines, but if the things aren't real, they won't crunch. End of scam. Sanderson has paid. Repetto has paid. The last word I had was he'd talked to Riemann. I don't believe any of this. They have all their own hardware. Why would they bother? They all have a high profile. People know that they have their own hardware. If things get ugly, it can be confiscated. Whereas this man, Paul Durham, is nobody. He's a broker for someone else, obviously, but whoever it is, they're acting like they have access to more computing power than Fujitsu, at about 1,000th of the cost. And none of it is on the open market. Nobody officially knows it exists. Or unofficially, because it doesn't. €2 million. Sanderson has paid. Repetto has paid. According to your sources. Durham's getting money from somewhere. I spoke to Malcolm Carter myself. Durham's commissioned a city from him, thousands of square kilometers, and none of it passive. Architectural detail everywhere down to visual acuity or better. Pseudo-autonomous crowds, hundreds of thousands of people. Zoos and wildlife parks with the latest behavioral algorithms. A waterfall the size of nothing on Earth. Pierre pulled out a coil of intestine and playfully wrapped it around his neck. You could have a city like that all to yourself if you really wanted it, if you were willing to live with the slowdown. Why are you so interested in this con man Durham? Even if he's genuine, you can't afford his price. Face it, you're stuck here in the slums with me, and it doesn't matter. Pierre indulged in a brief flashback to the last time they'd made love. He merged it with the current scene, so he saw both Kates, and the new lean, gray-eyed one seemed to look on as he lay on the floor gasping beneath his tangible memory of her earlier body, although in truth she saw him still sitting in the chair, smiling faintly. All memory is theft, Daniel Lebesgue had written. Pierre felt a sudden pang of postcoital guilt. But what was he guilty of? Perfect recollection, nothing more. Kate said, I can't afford Durham's price, but I can afford Carter's. Pierre was caught off guard for a second, but then he grinned at her admiringly. You're serious, aren't you? She nodded soberly. Yes, I've been thinking about it for some time, but after being flatlined for 10 hours. Are you sure Carter is serious? How do you know he really has something to sell? She hesitated. I hired him myself when I was outside. I used to spend a lot of time in VR as a visitor, and he made some of my favorite places. The Winter Beach, that cottage I took you to, and others. He was one of the people I talked it over with before I made up my mind to come in for good. Pierre regarded her uneasily. She rarely talked about the past, which suited him fine, and mercifully she returned to the point. With slowdown, filters, masks, it's hard to judge anymore. It's hard to judge anyone, but I don't think he's changed that much. I still trust him. Pierre nodded slowly, absent-mindedly sliding his intestine back and forth across his shoulders. But how much does Durham trust him? How thoroughly will he check the city for stowaways?
Carter's sure he can hide me. He has software that can break up my model and bury it deep in the city's algorithms, as a few billion trivial redundancies and inefficiencies.
Inefficiencies can get optimized out. If Durham.
Kate cut him off impatiently. Carter's not stupid. He knows how optimizers work, and he knows how to keep them from touching his stuff.
Okay, but once you're in there, what sort of communications will you have?
Not much, only limited powers to eavesdrop on what the legitimate inhabitants choose to access, and if the whole point of this place is secrecy, that may not be much. I get the impression from Carter they're planning to drag in everything they need, then pull up the drawbridge.
Peer let that sink in. Peer let that sink in, but chose not to ask the obvious question, or to show that he'd even thought of it. What do you get to take with you?
All the software and all the environments I've been using here, which doesn't amount to all that much data compared to me. And once I'm in, I'll have read-only access to all of the city's public facilities, all the information, all the entertainment, all the shared environments. I'll be able to walk down the main street, invisible and intangible, staring at the trillionaires. But my presence won't affect anything, except to slow it down by except to slow it all down by a negligible amount, so even the most rigorous verification should pass the total package as contamination-free.
What rate will you run at?
Kate snorted. I should refuse to answer that. You're the champion of one computation per year.
I'm just curious.
It depends on how many quips are allocated to the city. She hesitated. Carter has no real evidence for this, but he thinks there's a good chance that Durham's employers have got their hands on some kind of new high-powered hardware.
Peer groaned. Please, this whole deal is already suspect enough. Don't start invoking the mythical breakthrough. What makes people think that anyone could keep that a secret? Or that anyone would even want to?
They might not want to, in the long run, but the best way to exploit the technology might be to sell the first of the new generation of processors to the richest copies, before they hit the open market and the quips rate crashes.
Peer laughed. So then why stow away at all? If that happens, there'll be nothing to fear from weather control.
Because there might not have been any breakthrough. The only thing that's for certain is that some of the wealthiest and best informed copies have decided that it's worth going into this sanctuary, and I've got the chance to go with them.
Peer was silent for a while. Finally, he asked, So are you moving or cloning yourself?
Cloning.
He could have concealed his relief easily, but he didn't. He said, I'm glad. I would have missed you.
And I'd have missed you. I want you to come with me.
You want.
Kate leaned toward him. Carter has said he'll include you and your baggage for another 50%. Clone yourself and come with me. I don't want to lose you, either of me.
Peer felt a rush of excitement and fear. He took a snapshot of the emotion, then said, I don't know. I've never.
A second version running on the most secure hardware on the planet. That's not surrendering to outside. It's just finally gaining some true independence.
Independence? What if these copies get bored with Carter's City and decide to trash it, trade it in for something new?
Kate was unfazed. That's not impossible, but there are no guarantees on the public networks either. This way, at least you have a greater chance that one version will survive.
Peer tried to imagine it. Stowaways. No communications. Just us and whatever software we bring.
You're Solipsist Nation, aren't you?
You know I am. But I've never run a second version before. I don't know how I'll feel about that after the split.
Who will feel about it?
Kate bent over and picked up his heart.
Having a second version won't bother you. She fixed her new gray eyes on him. We're running at a slowdown of 67. Carter will be delivering his city to Durham 6 real-time months from now. But who knows when Operation Butterfly will flatline us again, so you don't have long to decide.
Peer continued to show Kate his body sitting in the chair, thinking it over, while in truth he rose to his feet and walked across the room, escaping her formidable gaze. Who am I? Is this what I want? He couldn't concentrate. He manually invoked a menu on one of the control screens, an array of a dozen identical images, a 19th century anatomical drawing of the brain, with the surface divided into regions labeled with various emotions and skills. Each icon represented a package of mental parameters, snapshots of previous states of mind, or purely synthetic combinations. Peer hit the icon named Clarity. In 12 short, real-time years as a copy, he'd tried to explore every possibility, map out every consequence of what he'd become. He'd transformed his surroundings, his body, his personality, his perceptions. But he'd always owned the experience himself. The tricks he'd played on his memory had added, never erased. And whatever changes he'd been through, there was always only one person, in the end, taking responsibility, picking up the pieces, one witness, unifying it all. The truth was, the thought of finally surrendering that unity made him dizzy with fear. It was the last vestige of his delusion of humanity. The last big lie. And as Daniel Lebesgue, founder of Solipsist Nation, had written, "My goal is to take everything which might be revered as quintessentially human and grind it into dust." He returned to his seated body and said, "I'll do it." Kate smiled, raised his beating heart to her lips, and gave it a long, lingering kiss. So this is one of the things I love about Gregg Egan is he's not only writing a book about how what is the world like if you've got people who can copy their brains into software. It's not only what are the possible ramifications of the digital immortality that may or may not provide. He's not only saying what if people want to ensure that they can be more safe. He's also having what if there were hitchhikers? What if there were stowaways into this haven? And the perspectives of them all. He's rich. He's coming up with rich ideas, is what I'm saying. His stuff is never simple. It's never one note. It's never. There's always more going on. It's one of the things I adore about his work. Chapter 6 Rip, Tie, Cut Toy Man, June 2045. So we're back in time now. Paul woke without any confusion. He dressed and ate, trying to feel optimistic. He'd demonstrated his willingness to cooperate. Now it was time to ask for something in return. He walked into the study, switched on the terminal, and called his own number. The djinn answered at once. Paul said, "I'd like to talk to Elizabeth." "Squeak?" "That's not possible." "Not possible? Why don't you just ask her?" "Squeak?" "I can't do that. She doesn't even know you exist." Paul stared at him Paul stared at him coldly. "Don't lie to me. It's a waste of time. As soon as I had a copy who survived, I was going to explain everything." "Squeak?" the djinn said dryly. "Or so we thought." Paul's certainty wavered. "You're telling me that your great ambition is finally being fulfilled, and you haven't even mentioned it to the one woman—" "Squeak?" Durham's face turned to stone. "I really don't wish to discuss it. Can we get on with the experiment, please?" Paul opened his mouth to protest, and then found he had nothing to say. All his anger and jealousy suddenly dissipated into embarrassment. It was as if he'd just come to his senses from a daydream, an elaborate fantasy of a relationship with someone else's lover. Paul and Elizabeth, Elizabeth and Paul. What happened between them was none of his business. Whatever his memories suggested, that life wasn't his to live anymore. He said, "Sure, let's get on with the experiment. Time is just rushing by. You must have turned 45, what, a day ago? Many happy returns." "Squeak?"
Thanks, but you're wrong. I took some shortcuts while you were asleep. I shut down part of the model and cheated on most of the rest. It's only the 4th of June. You got 6 hours sleep in 10 hours real time. Not a bad job, I thought.
Paul was outraged.
You had no right to do that.
Squeak! Durham sighed.
Be practical. Ask yourself what you'd have done in my place. It's not a joke.
Squeak!
So you slept without a whole body. I cleaned a few toxins out of your blood at a non-physiological rate.
The djinn seemed genuinely puzzled.
Compared to the experiments, that's nothing. Why should it bother you? You've woken up in exactly the same condition as you'd been in if you'd slept the normal way.
As you'd be in if you slept the normal way.
Paul caught himself. He didn't want to explain how vulnerable it made him feel to have someone reach through the cracks in the universe and relieve him of unnecessary organs while he slept. And the less the bastard knew about his copy's insecurities, the better. He'd only exploit them.
He said,
It bothers me because the experiments are worthless if you're going to intervene at random. Precise, controlled changes. That's the whole point. You have to promise me you won't do it again.
Squeak!
You're the one who was complaining about waste. Someone else to think about conserving our dwindling resources. Do you want me to keep on cooperating, or do you want to start everything again from scratch?
Squeak!
The djinn said mildly, All right, you don't have to threaten me. You have my word. No more ad hoc intervention.
Thank you.
Conserving our dwindling resources? Paul had been trying hard not to think about money. What would the djinn do when he could no longer afford to keep him running, if Paul chose not to bail out once the experiments were over? Store a snapshot of the model, of course, until he could raise the cash flow to start it up again. In the long term, set up a trust fund. It would only have to earn enough to run him part-time at first, keep him in touch with the world, stave off excessive culture shock, until the technology became cheap enough to let him live continuously. Of course, all these reassuring plans had been made by a man with two futures. Would he really want to keep an old copy running when he could save his money for a deathbed scan and his own immortality?
Squeak!
Can we get to work now? That's what I'm here for. This time, the model would be described at the standard time resolution of 1 millisecond throughout, but the order in which the states were computed would be varied.
Squeak!
Experiment 2, trial number 1, reverse order. Paul counted. 1, 2, 3, reverse order. After an initial leap into the future, he was now traveling backward through real time. It would have been a nice touch if he'd been able to view an external event on the terminal, some entropic cliché like a vase being smashed, knowing that it was himself and not the scene that was being rewound. But he knew that it couldn't be done, quite apart from the fact that it would have ruined the experiment, betraying the difference between subject and control. In real time, the first thing to be computed would be his model time final brain state, complete with memories of everything that had happened in the preceding 10 seconds. Those memories couldn't include having seen a real broken vase assemble itself from fragments, if the vase hadn't even been smashed yet. The trick could have been done with a simulation or a video recording of the real thing, but that wouldn't have been the same. 8, 9, 10. Another imperceptible leap into the future, and the djinn reappeared.
Squeak!
Trial number 2, odd numbered states, then even. In external terms, he would count to 10, skipping every second model time moment, then forget having done so, and count again, going back and filling the gaps. And from his own point of view? As he counted, once only, the external world, even if he couldn't see it, was flickering back and forth between two separate regions of time, which had been chopped up into 17 millisecond portions and interleaved. So, who was right? Paul thought it over, half seriously. Maybe both descriptions were equally valid. After all, relativity had abolished absolute time. Everybody was entitled to their own frame of reference, crossing deep space at close to light speed or skimming the event horizon of a black hole. Why shouldn't a copy's experience of time be as sacrosanct as that of any astronaut? The analogy was flawed, though. Relativistic transformations were smooth, possibly extreme, but always continuous. One observer's spacetime could be stretched and deformed in the eyes of another, but it couldn't be sliced like a loaf of bread and then shuffled like a deck of cards. Every 10th state in 10 sets. Paul counted, and for argument's sake tried to defend his own perspective, tried to imagine the outside world actually cycling through fragments of time drawn from 10 distinct periods. The trouble was, this allegedly shuddering universe contained the computer which ran the whole model, the infrastructure upon which everything else depended. If its orderly chronology had been torn to shreds, what was keeping him together, enabling him to ponder the question? Every 20th state in 20 sets. 19 episodes of amnesia, 19 new beginnings. Unless, of course, he was the control. Every 100th state in 100 sets. He'd lost any real feeling for what was happening. He just counted. Pseudo-random ordering of states. 1, 2, 3. Now he was dust. To an outside observer, these 10 seconds had been grouped up into 10,000 uncorrelated moments and scattered throughout real time. And in model time, the outside world had suffered an equivalent fate. Yet the pattern of his awareness remained perfectly intact. Somehow he found himself, assembled himself, from these scrambled fragments. He'd been taken apart like a jigsaw puzzle, but his dissection and shuffling were transparent to him. Somehow, on their own terms, the pieces remained connected. 8, 9, 10. Squeak! You're sweating? Both of me? Squeak! The djinn laughed. What do you think? Paul said, Do me one small favor. The experiment is over. Shut down one of me. Control a subject, I don't care. Squeak! Done. Now there's no need to conceal anything, is there? So run the pseudo-random effect on me again, and stay online. This time, you count to 10. Oh, one sec. Sorry about that. Things are busy. I'm juggling a few things. Where were we? Here we go. Let's just reread that last line. Now there's no need to conceal anything, is there? So run the pseudo-random effect on me again, and stay online. This time, you count to 10. Squeak! Durham shook his head. Can't do it, Paul. Think about it. You can't be computed non-sequentially when the past perceptions aren't known. Of course, the broken vase problem all over again. Paul said, Record yourself then and use that. The djinn seemed to find the request amusing, but he agreed. He even slowed down the recording so it lasted 10 model time seconds. Paul watched the blurred lips and jaws intently, listened carefully to the drone of white noise. Squeak! Happy now? You did scramble me and not the recording. Squeak! Of course. Your wish is my command. Yeah? Then do it again. Durham grimaced, but obliged. Paul said. Now scramble the recording.
It looked just the same. Of course.
Again. Squeak! What's the point of all this? Just do it.
Paul watched, the hairs on the back of his neck rising, convinced that he was on the verge of what? Finally confronting the obvious fact that the wildest permutations in the relationship between model time and real time would be undetectable to an isolated copy? He'd accepted the near certainty of that, tacitly, for almost 20 years. But the first-hand experience of having his mind literally scrambled to absolutely no effect was still provocative in a way that the abstract understanding had never been.
He said, When do we move on to the next stage? Squeak! Or so keen all of a sudden? Nothing's changed. I just want to get it over and done with. Squeak! Lining up all the other machines is taking some delicate negotiations. The network allocation software isn't designed to accommodate whims about geography. It's a bit like going to a bank and asking to deposit some money at a certain location in a particular computer's memory. Basically, people think I'm crazy.
Paul felt a momentary pang of empathy, recalling his own anticipation of these difficulties. Empathy verging on identification. He smothered it. The two of them were irreversibly different people now, with different problems and different goals, and the stupidest thing he could do would be to forget that.
Squeak! I could suspend you while I finalize the arrangements, save you the boredom, if that's what you want. You're too kind, but I'd rather stay conscious. I've got a lot to think about.
So you'll notice there's a little conceptual overlap here with uh, quarantine. Um, in terms of particularly when things really get underway in quarantine, like really get underway, when the plot starts getting rocket thrusters and he starts having like multiple different Egan states. This is something he's thought about clearly. He's got other stuff that deals with these dances around with these ideas. Some of them are short stories. Some of them are in his novels. This is the one that I think deals with it the most. Like, what do you do? How does that work? Well, fundamentally, you'd obviously be a different person because the very second you wake up and one of you is in a different environment, you're going to diverge. So it's interesting stuff. It's heady stuff. It's very heady stuff. Hmm, excuse me. Chapter 7. Remit Not Paucity. November 2050.
12 to 18 months? Are they sure?
Francesca De Luca said dryly.
What can I say? They modeled it.
Maria did her best to sound calm.
That's plenty of time. We'll get you scanned. We'll get the money together. I can sell the house and borrow some from Aiden.
Francesca smiled but shook her head.
No, darling.
Her hair had grayed a little since Maria had last really looked at her, last consciously gauged her appearance, but she showed no obvious signs of ill health.
What's the point? Even if I wanted that, and I don't, what's the use of a scan that will never be run? It will be run. Computing power will get cheaper. Everybody's counting on that. Thousands of people have scan files waiting. How many frozen corpses have ever been revived? That's not the same thing at all. How many? Physically, none. But some have been scanned and proved non-viable. All the interesting ones, the celebrities, the dictators, are brain damaged and nobody cares about the rest. A scan file is nothing like a frozen corpse. You'd never become non-viable. No, but I'd never become worth bringing back to life either.
Maria stared at her angrily.
I'll bring you back to life. Or don't you believe I'll ever have the money?
Francesca said,
Maybe you will, but I'm not going to be scanned, so forget about it.
Maria hunched forward on the couch, not knowing how to sit, not knowing where to put her hands. Sunlight streamed into the room, obscenely bright, revealing every speck of lint on the carpet. She had to make an effort not to get up and close the blinds.
Why hadn't Francesca told her on the phone? All of this would have been 1,000 times easier by phone.
She said, "All right, you're not going to be scanned. Someone in the world must be making nanomachines for liver cancer, even just experimental ones." "Not for this cell type. It's not one of the common oncogenes, and nobody's sure of the cell surface markers." "So they can still find them, can't they?" "They can look at the cells, identify the markers, and modify an existing nanomachine. All the information they need is there in your body." Maria pictured the mutant proteins which enabled me, me, oh, excuse me. Maria pictured the mutant proteins which enabled metastasis, poking through the cell walls, highlighted in ominous yellow. Francesca said, "With enough time and money and expertise, I'm sure that would be possible. But as it happens, nobody plans to do it in the next 18 months." Maria started shuddering. It came in waves. She didn't make a sound. She just sat and waited for it to pass. Finally, she said, "There must be drugs." Francesca nodded. "I'm on medication to slow the growth of the primary tumor and limit further metastasis. There's no point in a transplant. I already have too many secondary tumors. Actual liver failure is the least of my worries. There are general cytotoxic drugs I could take, and there's always radiation therapy, but I don't think the benefits are worth the side effects." "Would you like me to stay with you?" "No." "It'd be no trouble. You know I can work from anywhere." "There's no need for it. I'm not going to be an invalid." Maria closed her eyes. She couldn't imagine feeling this way for another hour, let alone another year. When her father had died of a heart attack 3 years before, she'd promised herself that she'd raise the money to have Francesca scanned by her 60th birthday. She was nowhere near on target. "I screwed up. I wasted time, and now it's almost too late." Thinking aloud, she said, "Maybe I'll get some work in Seoul." "I thought you decided not to go." Maria looked up at her, uncomprehending. "Why don't you want to be scanned? What are you afraid of? I'd protect you. I'd do whatever you asked. If you didn't want to be run until slowdown is abolished, I'd wait. If you wanted to wake up in a physical body, an organic body, I'd wait." Francesca smiled. "I know you would, darling. That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" "I don't want to argue about it." Maria was desperate. "I won't argue, but can't you tell me, please?" Francesca relented. "Listen, I was 33 when the first copy was made. You were 5 years old. You grew up with the idea. But to me, it's still too strange. It's something rich eccentrics do, the way they used to freeze their corpses. To me, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars for the chance to be imitated by a computer after my death is just farcical. I'm not an eccentric millionaire. I don't want to spend my money or yours building some kind of talking monument to my ego. I still have a sense of proportion." She looked at Maria imploringly. "Doesn't that count for anything anymore?" "You wouldn't be imitated. You'd be you." "Yes and no." "What's that supposed to mean? You always told me you believed—" "I do believe that copies are intelligent. I just wouldn't say that they are, or they aren't, the same person as the person they were based on. There's no right or wrong answer to that. It's a question of semantics, not a question of truth. The thing is, I have my own sense right now of who I am, what my boundaries are, and it doesn't include a copy of me run at some time in the indefinite future. Can you understand that? Being scanned wouldn't make me feel any better about dying. Whatever a copy of me might think if one was ever run. Whatever a copy of me might think if one was ever run." Maria said angrily, "That's just being perverse. That's as stupid as saying when you're 20 years old, 'I can't picture myself at 50. A woman that old wouldn't really be me.' And then killing yourself because there's nothing to lose but that older woman, and she's not inside your boundaries." "I thought you said you weren't going to argue." Maria looked away. "You never used to talk like this. You're the one who always told me that copies had to be treated exactly like human beings. If you hadn't been brainwashed by that religion—" "The Church of the God who makes no difference has no position on copies, one way or the other." "It has no position on anything." That's right. So it can hardly be their fault if I don't want to be scanned, can it? Maria felt physically sick. She'd held off saying anything on the subject for almost a year. She'd been astonished and appalled, but she'd struggled to respect her mother's choice. And now she could see that that had been insane, irresponsible beyond belief. You don't stand by and let someone you love, someone who gave you your own understanding of the world, have their brain turned to pulp. She said, "It's their fault because they've undermined your judgment. They fed you so much bullshit that you can't think straight about anything anymore." Francesca just looked at her reprovingly. Maria felt a pang of guilt. How can you make things harder for her now? How can you start attacking her when she's just told you that she's dying? But she wasn't going to fold now, take the easy way out, be supportive. She said, is that Maria saying it or Francesca? That's Maria saying it. She said, God makes no difference because God is the reason why everything is exactly what it is. That's supposed to make us all feel at peace with the cosmos, is it? Francesca shook her head. At peace? No, it's just a matter of clearing away once and for all old ideas like divine intervention and the need for some kind of proof or even faith in order to believe. Maria said, What do you need then? I don't believe, so what am I missing? Belief? And the love of tautology? Don't knock tautology. Better to base a religion on tautology than fantasy. But it's worse than tautology. It's redefining words arbitrarily. It's like something out of Lewis Carroll or George Orwell. God is the reason for everything, whatever the reason is. So what any sane person would simply call the laws of physics, you've decided to rename God solely because the word carries all kinds of historical resonances, all kinds of misleading connotations. You claim to have nothing to do with the old religions, so why keep using their terminology? Francesca said, We don't deny the history of the word. We make a break from the past in a lot of ways, but we also acknowledge our origins. God is a concept people have been using for millennia. The fact that we've refined the idea beyond primitive superstitions and wish fulfillment doesn't mean that we're not part of the same tradition. But you haven't refined the idea, you've made it meaningless, and rightly so. But you don't seem to realize it. You've stripped away all the obvious stupidities, all the anthropomorphism, the miracles, the answered prayers, but you don't seem to have noticed that once you've done that, there's absolutely nothing left that needs to be called religion. Physics is not theology. Ethics is not theology. Why pretend that they are? Francesca said, But don't you see? We talk about God for the simple reason that we still want to. There's a deeply ingrained human compulsion to keep using that word, that concept, to keep honing it rather than discarding it, despite the fact that it no longer means what it did 5,000 years ago. And you know perfectly well where that compulsion comes from. It has nothing to do with any real divine being. It's just a product of culture and neurobiology, a few accidents of evolution and history. Of course it is. What human trait isn't? So why give in to it? Francesca laughed. Why give in to anything? The religious impulse isn't some kind of alien mind virus. It's not, in its purest form, stripped of all content, the product of brainwashing. It's a part of who I am. Maria put her face in her hands. Is it? When you talk like this, it doesn't sound like you. Francesca said, Don't you ever want to give thanks to God when things are going well for you? Don't you ever want to ask God for strength when you need it? No. Well, I do, even though I know God makes no difference. And if God is the reason for everything, then God includes the urge to use the word God. So whenever I gain some strength or comfort or meaning from that urge, then God is the source of that strength, that comfort, that meaning. And if God, while making no difference, helps me to accept what's going to happen to me, why should that make you sad? On the train home, Maria sat next to a boy of about 7, who twitched all the way to the silent rhythms of a nerve-induced PMV, participatory music video. Nerve induction had been developed to treat epilepsy, but now its most common use seemed to bring about the symptoms it was meant to alleviate. Glancing at him sideways, she could see his eyeballs fluttering behind his mirror shades. As the shock of the news diminished slightly, Maria began to see things more clearly. It was really all about money, not religion. She wants to be a martyr to save me from spending a cent. All the rest is rationalization. She must have picked up a load of archaic bullshit from her own parents about the virtues of not being a burden, not imposing too much on the next generation, not ruining the best years of their lives. She'd left her cycle in a locker at Central Station. She rode home slowly through the leisurely Sunday evening traffic, still feeling drained and shaky, but a little more confident now that she'd had a chance to think it through. 12 to 18 months, she'd raise the money in less than a year. Somehow. She'd show Francesca that she could shoulder the burden, and once that was done, her mother could stop inventing excuses. Home, she started some vegetables boiling, then went upstairs and checked for mail. There were 6 items under junk, 4 under autoverse, and nothing under boring but lucrative. Since her letter in Autoverse Review, almost every subscriber had been in touch, with congratulations, requests for more data, offers of collaboration, and a few borderline crank calls full of misunderstandings and complaints. Her success with A. Lamberti had even made the Big Time, a slightly less specialized journal, Cellular Automaton World. It was all strangely anticlimactic, and in a way she was glad of that. It put things into perspective. She trashed all the junk mail with a sweep of her hand across the touch screen, then sat for a moment gazing at the icons for the Autoverse messages, contemplating doing the same to them. I have to get my act together, concentrate on earning money, and stop wasting time on this shit. She ran the first message. A teenage girl in Kansas City complained that she couldn't duplicate Maria's results, and proceeded to describe her own tortuous version of the experiment. Maria stopped and deleted the file after viewing 20 seconds. She'd already replied at length to half a dozen like it, and any sense of obligation she'd felt to the Autoverse community had vanished in the process. As she started the second message running, she smelled something burning downstairs, and suddenly remembered that the stove had been brain dead since Friday. Everything had to be watched, and she couldn't even switch off the hot plates remotely. She turned up the volume on the terminal and headed for the kitchen. The spinach was a blackened mess. She threw the saucepan across the narrow room. It rebounded, almost to her feet. She picked it up again and started smashing it against the wall beside the stove, until the tiles began to crack and fall to the floor. Damaging the house was more satisfying than she'd ever imagined. It felt like rending her clothes, like tearing out her hair, like self-mutilation. She pounded the wall relentlessly until she was breathless, giddy, running with sweat, her face flushed with a strange heat she hadn't felt since childhood tantrums. Her mother touched her cheek with the back of her hand, brushing away tears of anger. The cool skin, the wedding ring. Shh! Look at the state you're in. You're burning up. After a while, she calmed down, and noticed that the message was still playing upstairs. The sender must have programmed it to repeat indefinitely until she acknowledged it. She sat on the floor and listened. My name is Paul Durham. I read your article in Autoverse Review. I was very impressed by what you've done with A. Lamberti, and if you think you might be interested in being funded to take it further, call me back on this number and we can talk about it. Maria had to listen 3 more times before she was certain she understood the message. Being funded to take it further. The phrasing seemed deliberately coy and ambiguous, but in the end it could only really mean one thing. Some idiot was offering her a job. When Durham asked to meet her in person, Maria was too surprised to do anything but agree. Durham said he lived in North Sydney and suggested that they meet the next morning in the city at the Market Street Cafe. Maria, unable to think of a plausible excuse on the spot, just nodded, thankful that she'd made the call through a software filter which would erase any trace of anxiety from her face and tone of voice. Most programming contracts did not involve interviews, even by phone. The tendering process was usually fully automated, based entirely on the quotes submitted and the tenderer's audited performance record. Maria hadn't faced an interview in the flesh since she'd applied for part-time cleaning jobs as a student. It was only after she'd broken the connection that she realized she still had no idea what Durham wanted from her. A real Autoverse fanatic might, just conceivably, part with money for the privilege of collaborating with her, perhaps footing the bills for computer time, for the sake of sharing the kudos of any further results. It was hard to think of any other explanation. Maria lay awake half the night, looking back on the brief conversation, wondering if she was missing something blindingly obvious, wondering if it could be some kind of hoax. Just before 2, she got up and did a hasty literature search of Autoverse Review and a handful of other cellular automaton journals. There were no articles by anyone named Durham. Around 3 o'clock, she gave up pondering the question and managed to force herself to sleep. She dreamed that she was still awake, distraught at the news of her mother's illness, and then, realizing that she was only dreaming, cursed herself angrily because this proof of her love was nothing but an illusion. Chapter 8 Remit Not Paucity, November 2050. Thomas took the elevator from his office to his home. In life, the journey had been a 10-minute ride on the S-Bahn, but after almost 4 subjective months, he was gradually becoming accustomed to the shortcut. Today, he began the ascent without giving it a second thought, admiring the oak paneling, lulled by the faint hum of the motor. But halfway up, for no good reason, he suffered a moment of vertigo, as if the elegant coffin had gone into free fall. When first resurrected, he'd worried constantly over which aspects of his past he should imitate for the sake of sanity, and which he should discard as a matter of honesty. A window with a view of the city seemed harmless enough, but to walk and ride through an artificial crowd scene struck him as grotesque, and the few times he'd tried it, he'd found it acutely distressing. It was too much like life, and too much like his dream of one day being among people again. He had no doubt that he would have become desensitized to the illusion with time, but he didn't want that. When he finally inhabited a telepresence robot as lifelike as his lost body, when he finally rode a real train again and walked down a real street, he didn't want the joy of the experience dulled by years of perfect imitation. He had no wish to delude himself, but apart from declining to mimic his corporeal life to the point of parody, it was hard to define exactly what that meant. He balked at the prospect of the nearest door always opening magically onto his chosen destination, and he had no desire to snap his fingers and teleport. Acknowledging and exploiting the unlimited plasticity of virtual reality might have been the most honest thing to do, but Thomas needed a world with a permanent structure, not a dream city which reconfigured itself to his every whim. Eventually, he'd found a compromise. He'd constructed an auxiliary geography, or architecture, for his private version of Frankfurt, an alternative topology for the city, in which all the buildings he moved between were treated as being stacked one on top of the other, allowing a single elevator shaft to link them all. His house, in the suburbs, began 16 stories above his city office. In between were boardrooms, restaurants, galleries, and museums. Having decided upon the arrangement, he now regarded it as immutable. And if the view from each place, once he arrived, blatantly contradicted the relationship, he could live with that degree of paradox. Thomas stepped out of the elevator into the ground floor entrance hall of his home. The 2-story building, set in a modest 10 hectares of garden, was his alone, as the real-world original had been from the time of his divorce until his terminal illness, when a medical team had moved in. At first, he'd had cleaning robots gliding redundantly through the corridors, and gardening robots at work in the flower beds, viewing them as part of the architecture as much as the drain pipes, the air conditioning grills, and countless other unnecessary fixtures. He'd banished the robots after the first week. The drain pipes remained. His dizziness had passed, but he strode into the library and poured himself a drink from 2 cut-glass decanters, a bracing mixture of confidence and optimism. With a word, he could have summoned up a full mood control panel, an apparition which always reminded him of a recording studio's mixing deck, and adjusted the parameters of his state of mind, until he reached a point where he no longer wished to change the settings. But he'd become disenchanted with that nakedly technological metaphor. Mood-altering drugs, here, could function with a precision and a lack of side effects which no real chemical could ever have achieved. Pharmacological accuracy was possible, but hardly mandatory, and it felt more natural to gulp down a mouthful of spirits for fortification than it did to make adjustments via a hovering bank of sliding potentiometers. Even if the end result was exactly the same. Thomas sank into a chair as the drink started to take effect. As a matter of choice, it worked gradually, a pleasant warmth diffusing out from his stomach before his brain itself was gently manipulated, and began trying to make sense of his encounter with Paul Durham. "You have to let me show you exactly what you are." There was a terminal beside the chair. He hit a button, and one of his personal assistants, Hans Luhr, appeared on the screen. Thomas said casually, "Find out what you can about my visitor, will you?" Luhr replied at once, "Yes, sir." Thomas had 6 assistants, on duty in shifts around the clock, all flesh and blood humans, but so thoroughly wired that they were able to switch their mental processes back and forth between normal speed and slowdown at will. Thomas kept them at a distance, communicating with them only by terminal. The distinction between a visitor in the flesh and a mere image on a screen didn't bear much scrutiny, but in practice it could still be rigorously enforced. He sometimes thought of his staff as working in Munich or Berlin, far enough away to explain the fact that he never met them in person, and yet near enough to make a kind of metaphorical sense of their ability to act as go-betweens with the outside world. He'd never bothered to find out where they really were, in case the facts contradicted this convenient mental image. He sighed, took another swig of C&O. It was a balancing act, a tightrope walk. A copy could go insane either way. Caring too much about the truth could lead to a pathological obsession with the infrastructure, the algorithms and optical processors, the machinery of deception which lay beneath every surface. Caring too little, you could find yourself gradually surrendering to a complacent fantasy in which life had gone on as normal, and everything which contradicted the illusion of ordinary physical existence was avoided or explained away. Was that Durham's real intention, to drive him mad? Thomas had ordered the usual cursory screening before letting Durham in, revealing only that the man worked as a salesman for Griffin Financial Products, a moderately successful Anglo-Australian company, and that he possessed no criminal record. Elaborate precautions were hardly warranted. Visitors could do no harm. Thomas's VR consultants had assured him that nothing short of tampering with the hardware in situ could ever damage or corrupt the system. No mere signal coming down the fiber from the outside world could penetrate the protected layers of the software. Visitors who wreaked havoc, introducing viruses by the fiendishly clever binary modulated snapping of their fingers, were the stuff of fiction. Literally, Thomas had seen it happen once on The Unclear Family. Durham had said, "I'm not going to lie to you. I've spent time in a mental institution. 10 years. I suffered delusions, bizarre, elaborate delusions, and I realize now that I was seriously ill. I can look back and understand that. But at this very same time, I can look back and remember what it was that I believed was happening when I was insane. And without for one moment ceasing to acknowledge my condition, I still find those memories so convincing." Thomas's skin crawled. He raised his glass, and then put it down. He knew that if he kept on drinking, nothing the man had said would unsettle him in the least. But he hadn't drunk enough yet to be absolutely sure that that was what he wanted. "If you're not prepared to perform the experiment yourself, at least think about the implications. Imagine that you've modified the way in which you are computed, and imagine what the consequences would be. A Gedanken experiment. Is that too much to ask for? In a sense, that's all I ever performed myself.
The terminal chimed. Thomas took the call.
Laura said, I have a preliminary report on poor Durham. Would you like me to read it?
Thomas shook his head. I'll view the file. He skimmed it, at level 1 detail. Paul Kingsley Durham, born in Sydney on June 6, 2000. Parents, Elizabeth Ann Maddox and John Arthur Durham, joint owners of a delicatessen in the Sydney suburb of Concord from 1996 to 2032. Retired to Mackay, Queensland. Now both deceased by natural causes. Educated at a government high school. 2017. Higher school certificate aggregate score in 3rd percentile. Best subjects physics and mathematics. 2018. Completed 1 year of a science degree at Sydney University. Passed all examinations but discontinued studies. 2019 to 2023. Traveled in Thailand, Burma, India, Nepal. 2024. On return to Australia, diagnosed with an organic delusional syndrome, probably congenital. Condition partly controlled by medication. Numerous casual laboring jobs until May 2029. Condition deteriorating. Disability pension granted January 2031. Committed to psychiatric ward of Blacktown Hospital on September 4, 2035. Corrective nanosurgery to the hippocampus and prefrontal cerebral cortex performed on November 11, 2045. Declared a complete success. Thomas switched to level 2 to fill in the 10-year gap, but found little more than a long list of the drugs, neural grafts, and gene therapy vectors which had been injected into Durham's skull during that period, to no apparent benefit. There were frequent notes that the treatments had been tested first on a set of partial brain models, but hadn't worked in practice. Thomas wondered if Durham had been told about this, and wondered what the man imagined happened when a drug was evaluated on 15 separate models of different regions of the brain, which, taken together, encompassed the entire organ. 2046 to 2048, studying finance and administration at Macquarie University. 2049, graduated with first-class honors and immediately hired by Griffin as a trainee salesman. As of January 17, 2050, working in the Artificial Intelligence Division, which meant selling protection, in various guises, to copies who were afraid that their assets were going to be pulled out from under them. Durham's job description would certainly cover spending long hours as a visitor, if not quite stretching to matters like disclosing details of his personal psychiatric history or suggesting metaphysical Gedanken experiments to his clients. Or, indeed, wasting time on copies obviously far too secure to need Griffin's services. Thomas leaned back from the terminal. It was almost too simple. Durham had fooled his doctors into believing that they'd cured him, and then, with typical paranoid ingenuity and tenacity, he'd set about getting himself into a position where he could meet copies, share the great truth that had been revealed to him, and try to extract a little money in the process. If Thomas contacted Griffin and told them what their mad salesman was up to, Durham would certainly lose his job, probably end up in an institution again, and hopefully benefit from a second attempt at nanosurgery. Durham probably wasn't harming anybody, but ensuring that he received treatment was, surely, the kindest thing to do. A confident, optimistic person would make the call at once. Thomas eyed his drink, but decided to hold off a little longer before drowning the alternatives. Durham had said, I understand that everything I believe I've experienced was due to my illness, and I know there's no easy way to persuade you that I'm not still insane. But even if that were true, why should it make the questions I've raised any less important to you? Most flesh and blood humans live and die without knowing or caring what they are, scoffing at the very idea that it should matter. But you're not flesh and blood, and you can't afford the luxury of ignorance. Thomas rose and walked over to the mirror above the fireplace. Superficially, his appearance was still based largely on his final scan. He had the same unruly, thick white hair and the same loose, mottled, translucent 85-year-old skin.
He had the bearing of a young man, though. The model constructed from the scan file had been thoroughly rejuvenated, internally, sweeping away 60 years' worth of deterioration in every joint, every muscle, every vein and artery. He wondered if it was only a matter of time before vanity got the better of him, and he did the same with his appearance. Many of his business associates were unaging gradually, but a few had leaped back 20, 30, 50 years, or changed their appearances completely. Which was most honest? Looking like an 85-year-old flesh and blood human, which he was not, or looking the way he'd prefer to look, prefer to be, given the choice. And he did have the choice. He closed his eyes, put his fingertips to his cheek, explored the damaged skin. If he believed these ruins defined him, they defined him. And if he learned to accept a new young body, the same would be true of it. And yet, he couldn't shake the notion that external rejuvenation would entail nothing more than constructing a youthful mask, while his true face continued to exist and age somewhere. Pure Dorian Gray, a stupid moralistic fable stuffed with eternal verities long obsolete. And it was good to just and it was good just to feel healthy and vigorous, to be free of the arthritis, the aches and cramps and chills, the shortness of breath he could still remember vividly. Anything more seemed too easy, too arbitrary. Any copy could become a Hollywood Adonis in an instant. And any copy could outrace a bullet, lift a building, move a planet from its course. Thomas opened his eyes, reached out and touched the surface of the mirror, aware that he was avoiding making a decision. But one thing still bothered him. Why had Durham chosen him? The man might be deluded, but he was also intelligent and rational on some level. Of all the copies whose insecurities he might have tried to exploit, why choose one with a watertight setup, secure hardware, a well-managed trust fund? Why choose a target who appeared to have absolutely nothing to fear? Thomas felt the vertigo returning. It had been 65 years. Not one newspaper story or police report had mentioned his name. No database search, however elaborate, could link him to Anna. Nobody alive could know what he'd done, least of all a 50-year-old ex-psychiatric patient from the other side of the world. Even the man who'd committed the crime was dead. Thomas had seen him cremated. Did he seriously think that Durham's offer of sanctuary was some elaborately coded euphemism for not dredging up the past? Blackmail? No, that was ludicrous. So why not make a few calls and have the poor man seen to? Why not pay for him to be treated by the best Swiss neurosurgeon, who'd verify the procedure in advance on the most sophisticated set of partial brain models? Or did he believe that there was a chance that Durham was telling the truth? That he could run a second copy in a place nobody could reach in a billion years? The terminal chimed. Thomas said, "Yes?" Hedrick had taken over from Lure. Sometimes the shift seemed to change so fast that it made Thomas giddy. "You have a meeting of the Geist Bank board in 5 minutes, sir." "Thank you, I'll be right down." Thomas checked his appearance in the mirror. He said, "Comb me." His hair was made passably tidy, his complexion less pale, his eyes clear. Certain facial muscles were relaxed, and others tightened. His suit required no attention. As in life, it could not be wrinkled. He almost laughed, but his newly combed expression discouraged it. Expediency, honesty, complacency, insanity. It was a tightrope walk. He was 90 years old by one measure, 85 and a half by another, and he still didn't know how to live. On his way out, he picked up his confidence and optimism and poured it on the carpet. Chapter 9. Rip, Tie, Cut Toy Man. June 2045. Paul took the stairs down and circled the block a few times, hoping for nothing more than to forget himself for a while. He was tired of having to think about what he was every waking moment. The streets around the building were familiar enough, not to let him delude himself, but at least to allow him to take himself for granted. It was hard to separate fact from rumor, but he'd heard that even the giga-rich tended to live in relatively mundane surroundings, favoring realism over power fantasies. A few models of psychotics had reportedly set themselves up as dictators in opulent palaces, waited on hand and foot, but most copies aimed for an illusion of continuity. If you desperately wanted to convince yourself that you were the same person as your memory suggested, the worst thing to do would be to swan around a virtual antiquity, with mod cons, pretending to be Cleopatra or Ramses II. Paul didn't believe that he was his original. He knew he was nothing but a cloud of ambiguous data. The miracle was that he was capable of believing that he existed at all. What gave him that sense of identity? Continuity. Consistency. Thought following thought in a coherent pattern. But where did that coherence come from? In a human, or a copy being run in the usual way, the physics of brain or computer meant that the state of mind at any one moment directly influenced the state of mind that followed. Continuity was a simple matter of cause and effect. What you thought at time A affected what you thought at time B, affected what you thought at time C, and so on. But when his subjective time was scrambled, the flow of cause and effect within the computer bore no relationship whatsoever to the flow of his experience. So how could it be an essential part of it? When the program spelled out his life DBCEA, but it still felt exactly like ABCDE, then surely the pattern was all, and cause and effect were irrelevant. The whole experience might just as well have arisen by chance. Suppose an intentionally haywire computer sat for 1,000 years or more, switching from state to state in the sway of nothing but electrical noise. Might it embody consciousness? In real time, the answer was probably not, the probability of any kind of coherence arising at random being so small. Real time, though, was only one possible reference frame. What about all the others? If the states the machine passed through could be rearranged in time arbitrarily, then who could say what kind of elaborate order might emerge from the chaos? Paul caught himself. Was that fatuous? As absurd as insisting that every room full of monkeys really did type the complete works of Shakespeare, they just happened to put the letters in a slightly different order? As ludicrous as claiming that every large enough quantity of rock contained Michelangelo's David, and every warehouse full of paint and canvas contained the complete works of Rembrandt and Picasso, not in any mere latent form, awaiting some skillful forger to physically rearrange them, but solely by virtue of the potential redefinition of the coordinates of space-time? For a statue or a painting, yes, it was a joke. Where was the observer who perceived the paint to be in contact with the canvas, who saw the stone figure suitably delineated by air? If the pattern in question was not an isolated object, though, but a self-contained world, complete with at least one observer to join up the dots from within, there was no doubt that it was possible. He'd done it. In the final trial of the second experiment, he'd assembled himself and his surroundings effortlessly from the dust of randomly scattered moments, from apparent white noise in real time. From apparent white noise in real time, sorry. Wrong emphasis on the right syllables. True, what the computer had done had been contrived, guaranteed to contain his thoughts and perceptions coded into its seemingly aimless calculations, but given a large enough collection of truly random numbers, there was no reason to believe that it wouldn't include, purely by accident, hidden patterns as complex and coherent as the ones which underlay him. And wouldn't those patterns, however scrambled they might be in real time, be conscious of themselves just as he'd been conscious, and piece their own subjective world together just as he had done? Paul returned to the apartment, fighting off a sense of giddiness and unreality. So much for forgetting himself, he felt more charged than ever with the truth of his strange nature. Did he still want to bail out? No. No. How could he declare that he'd happily wake and forget himself, wake and reclaim his life, when he was beginning to glimpse the answers to questions which his original had never even dared to ask? And with that, I will leave you. I have to run. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. I appreciate it, and I hope you appreciate or enjoy at least what I've read. Um, Thanks to everyone who tunes in again. Because I've got to make this quick, we'll make it quick. If you're tuning in after the fact and you're wondering, why are these so rough around the edges? Why is he getting interrupted by stuff? It's because I do them live and I don't edit them. Ever. I don't edit them. I don't. The only editing I ever do is maybe the title if I screw something up. Sometimes not even then. I goof occasionally. Uh, think of it as a work of performance art preserved in digital temporary eternity. Like a copy, even. Hmm. Would that it had its own life. Ugh. It's spooky. It's really spooky to contemplate. It's some good stuff. Great posthumanism stuff. Some of Gregg Egan's posthumanist work is just like, oh, he goes so far beyond the bell curve of what people usually are thinking about when you get into those nitty gritties. It's wonderful. I love him. I love him for it. But yeah, with that, I got to run. I do these live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, starting at 12 noon U.S. East Coast time, Eastern Standard Time, or UTC minus 5 or 6, whichever it is. Anyway, with that, I got to run. Thanks again. Stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. I will seize you all later. Toodaloo. Oh, right. This Friday, we will be starting The Dark Forest by Shijin Liu. So people who are looking forward to that have that to look forward to. That is a long one. It is going to take us a while to get through. If I am doing like 50 pages a week, it is going to take like 10 weeks. It's going to be a long one. I'm going to probably do it in larger, longer streams for that reason alone. Because otherwise, we will be at it forever, and it will take another year to get through the next 1, 2, 3 books that I have slated. 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, including this one. On Monday, I don't know what I'm going to do yet. I'm reasonably locked in that I'm going to do the first collection volume of Full Metal Panic by, I can't remember the author's name. Some Japanese guy. I can't remember the name off the top of my head. I apologize. It is a rom-com and a military sci-fi thriller. So uh, there's going to be a dichotomy there, and the rom-com stuff is frankly fairly goofy, but it works as a nice release valve, particularly later on when things are like serious almost to the entire time. We'll get there. It's fun. I am looking forward to that because it's pretty. The translation is actually brilliant. I went into it with kind of low expectations because a bunch of the stuff that I'd read recently that had been translated from Japanese was kind of stiff and or dry. But this is not. This is very. This flows very naturally. I will not easily be able to show off some of the. There's some pictures in there. I won't be able to easily show those off. I'll do a cursory search through the Webernets to see if those pop up anywhere. But probably I'll just go with cover art and maybe like pictures of the giant robots involved. Anyway, with that, I'm going to